I was one of those who mocked the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the heart of Puebla's Zocalo, in front of all the people who had come on pilgrimage from the most distant ranches of Tlaxcala. It was December, the streets filled with torches, the cold air cutting into our faces, and thousands of people walking barefoot with their ayates laden with flowers and candles. I arrived with my megaphone in hand, shouting that it was all pure superstition, that it was idolatry of the devil, that only Jesus Christ saves, and that Mary is already dead. When I saw the giant tilma hanging in the atrium of the basilica, with that dark-skinned image they so venerate, I didn't think twice. I pushed through the crowd, climbed the volcanic stone steps, and, not caring about anything, I spat directly onto the glass protecting the image. People screamed as if I had killed someone. There were women who fainted right there. An older man yelled at me that I was sacrilegious, that I was going to be punished by God, but I pushed him away too. I told him the punishment was for them, that worshipping holy cards was a work of the devil, that Juan Diego never existed, that it was all an invention of the Spanish to dominate the indigenous people, and that they were blind, completely blind. At that moment, I felt like a warrior of truth, as if God himself were speaking through my mouth to awaken those ignorant people who were prostrating themselves before a painting. I walked out into the crowd with my chest puffed out, hearing shouts of anger and also some applause from Pentecostal brothers who had followed me from Cholula. There were about 8 or 10 of us from my congregation who said I had guts, that I was a true servant of the Almighty, a modern-day prophet, and I believed it completely. Throughout the Puebla and Tlaxcala regions, I was known as Pastor Ezekiel, the idol destroyer. I had already made several YouTube videos preaching against Guadalupanism, claiming that the Mass was Aztec witchcraft in disguise, that the Dark Virgin was a satanic invention meant to deceive Mexicans, and that the apparitions at Tepeyac were pure colonial theater. I had thousands of followers on social media. Some feared me, others admired me as if I were a special anointed one. I preached forcefully, without mincing words. I wasn't afraid of anyone, not even my own family, who suffered because of my radicalism. My mother, for example, was a true Guadalupan, one of those from the Xochimilco neighborhood who have little altars in every corner of the house, candles lit day and night, and pray the rosary every morning before going to the market. One day, I went to visit her and found an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in her kitchen, next to the gas stove, surrounded by marigold flowers. I became terribly angry. I grabbed the image, threw it on the cement floor, and it shattered into pieces. I yelled at her that she was bringing a curse on her house, that she was inviting Nahuatl demons into her home, that she had to truly convert to pure Christianity. My mother wept bitterly, but I didn't apologize. I told her she had to choose between Jesus or the indigenous idols. My sister was also devout. She took her children to catechism at St. Joseph Parish. I called her every week to tell her she was teaching my nephews pagan heresies, that she was condemning them to hell with those Catholic traditions. I went so far as to forbid them from coming to dinner on Christmas Eve because they had attended the Mañanitas on December 12th. Imagine how far I went with my fanaticism. In my head, everything was black or white. You were either with Christ or you were lost forever. And the Virgin of Guadalupe, for me, represented everything wrong with Mexico, all the religious syncretism that I believed had corrupted true Christianity. I used to say in my sermons that if Juan Diego were alive, he would be weeping at the sight of so many people kneeling before a tilma, worshiping a dark-skinned woman instead of the living God. There was a time when a neighbor, Doña Carmen, had placed a tiny image of Our Lady of Guadalupe in a planter outside the neighborhood church so people could cross themselves as they passed by. I secretly grabbed that image, put it in a garbage bag, and threw it in a municipal dumpster as if I were doing all of humanity a favor. And the worst part was that I felt proud. I felt righteous, like those Old Testament prophets who destroyed the idols of Baal. I filled my services talking about this, organized collective fasts against Guadalupanism, and sent the brothers to pray for the demolition of the city's Catholic strongholds. And every time I saw someone wearing a Medal of the Virgin or a Juan Diego t-shirt, I felt rage in my stomach. It wasn't holy zeal. It was pure rage, as if they were offending me personally. And the people in my church gave me a standing ovation, saying I was brave, that I didn't sell out to the corrupt religious system, that I said what other pastors didn't dare say out of cowardice. But at that time, I didn't realize that it wasn't God speaking through me. It was my pride, my inner venom, my hatred disguised as religious zeal. I thought I was a soldier of truth, but in reality, I was just a man filled with resentment who used the Bible as a weapon to hurt anyone who thought differently. I was convinced that God had chosen me in a special way, that I had a unique prophetic anointing to unmask the Guadalupe deception that, according to me, had blinded millions of Mexicans. That was my mission, my purpose, my reason for existing. But all that was about to change in the most unexpected and painful way I could ever imagine. I was one of those who mocked the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the heart of Puebla's Zocalo, in front of all the people who had come on pilgrimage from the most distant ranches of Tlaxcala. It was December, the streets filled with torches, the cold air cutting into our faces, and thousands of people walking barefoot with their ayates laden with flowers and candles. I arrived with my megaphone in hand, shouting that it was all pure superstition, that it was idolatry of the devil, that only Jesus Christ saves, and that Mary is already dead. When I saw the giant tilma hanging in the atrium of the basilica, with that dark-skinned image they so venerate, I didn't think twice. I pushed through the crowd, climbed the volcanic stone steps, and not caring about anything, I spat directly onto the glass protecting the image. People screamed as if I had killed someone. There were women who fainted right there. An older gentleman shouted at me that I was sacrilegious, that I was going to be punished by God, but I pushed him away too. I told him the punishment was for them, that worshipping holy cards was a work of the devil, that Juan Diego never existed, that it was all an invention of the Spanish to dominate the indigenous people, and that they were blind, completely blind. At that moment, I felt like a warrior of truth, as if it were God himself speaking through my mouth to awaken those ignorant people who were prostrating themselves before a painting. I walked out into the crowd with my chest puffed out, hearing shouts of anger and also some applause from Pentecostal brothers who had followed me from Cholula. There were about 8 or 10 of us from my congregation who said I had guts, that I was a true servant of the Almighty, a modern-day prophet, and I completely believed it. Throughout the Puebla and Tlaxcala regions, I was known as Pastor Ezekiel, the idol destroyer. I had already made several YouTube videos preaching against Guadalupanism, claiming that the Mass was Aztec witchcraft in disguise, that the Dark Virgin was a satanic invention meant to deceive Mexicans, and that the apparitions at Tepeyac were pure colonial theater. I had thousands of followers on social media. Some feared me, others admired me as if I were a special anointed one. I preached forcefully, without mincing words. I wasn't afraid of anyone, not even my own family, who suffered because of my radicalism. My mother, for example, was a true Guadalupan, one of those from the Xochimilco neighborhood who have little altars in every corner of the house, candles lit day and night, and pray the rosary every morning before going to the market. One day, I went to visit her and found an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in her kitchen, next to the gas stove, surrounded by marigold flowers. I became terribly angry. I grabbed the image, threw it on the cement floor, and it shattered into pieces. I yelled at her that she was bringing a curse on her house, that she was inviting Nahuatl demons into her home, that she had to truly convert to pure Christianity. My mother wept bitterly, but I didn't apologize. I told her she had to choose between Jesus or the indigenous idols. My sister was also devout. She took her children to catechism at St. Joseph Parish. I called her every week to tell her she was teaching my nephews pagan heresies, that she was condemning them to hell with those Catholic traditions. I went so far as to forbid them from coming to dinner on Christmas Eve because they had attended the Mañanitas on December 12th. Imagine how far I went with my fanaticism. In my head, everything was black or white. You were either with Christ or you were lost forever. And the Virgin of Guadalupe, for me, represented everything wrong with Mexico. all the religious syncretism that I believed had corrupted true Christianity. I used to say in my sermons that if Juan Diego were alive, he would be weeping at the sight of so many people kneeling before a tilma, worshiping a dark-skinned woman instead of the living God. There was a time when a neighbor, Doña Carmen, had placed a tiny image of Our Lady of Guadalupe in a planter outside the neighborhood church so people could cross themselves as they passed by. I secretly grabbed that image, put it in a garbage bag, and threw it in a municipal dumpster as if I were doing all of humanity a favor. And the worst part was that I felt proud. I felt righteous, like those Old Testament prophets who destroyed the idols of Baal. I filled my services talking about this, organized collective fasts against Guadalupanism, and sent the brothers to pray for the demolition of the city's Catholic strongholds. And every time I saw someone wearing a Medal of the Virgin or a Juan Diego t-shirt, I felt rage in my stomach. It wasn't holy zeal. It was pure rage, as if they were offending me personally. And the people in my church gave me a standing ovation, saying I was brave, that I didn't sell out to the corrupt religious system, that I said what other pastors didn't dare say out of cowardice. But at that time, I didn't realize that it wasn't God speaking through me. It was my pride, my inner venom, my hatred disguised as religious zeal. I thought I was a soldier of truth, but in reality, I was just a man filled with resentment who used the Bible as a weapon to hurt anyone who thought differently. I was convinced that God had chosen me in a special way, that I had a unique prophetic anointing to unmask the Guadalupe deception that, according to me, had blinded millions of Mexicans. That was my mission, my purpose, my reason for existing. But all that was about to change in the most unexpected and painful way I could ever imagine. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I heard my wife's heart-rending scream from the patio of our house on the outskirts of Cholula. I ran over and found my son Diego lying on the concrete floor, blood pouring from his head. He had fallen from the roof where he was trying to fix the television antenna. He was barely 17 years old. My son, my only son, was unconscious. His eyes rolled back, his breathing very shallow. Total panic gripped the house. We loaded him into the car and made a mad dash for Puebla General Hospital. From there, we were rushed to the University Hospital in the capital. The doctors ran tests, X-rays, and CT scans, and the news kept getting worse. Severe head trauma, they said, cerebral hemorrhage. My son fell into a coma that same day, and from then on, everything started to get worse. The first few days, I maintained my unwavering faith. I prayed day and night without stopping, fasted like I had never fasted before, anointed his forehead with holy oil, spoke in tongues for hours, and rebuked all manner of evil spirits. I declared that it was a direct attack from the enemy against my ministry, that God would manifest his glory by completely healing him. But the weeks passed, and nothing changed. Each medical report was colder than the last. Critical neurological status, no response to external stimuli, possibly permanent brain damage. The doctors had given up hope, but I remained there in the hospital room with my hands raised, shouting Bible verses, declaring healing, prophesying restoration, just as I had always done from the pulpit. At first, the members of the church still came to visit us, bringing tamales, fresh water, words of encouragement, prayer chains, but after 15 days they began to disappear. Some whispered behind my back that I was reaping what I had sown, that perhaps all the anger I had carried inside had turned against me. Others said God was testing me like Job, but most simply walked away without explanation. The first Sunday after the accident, I went to church and preached with more fury than ever, pounding the pulpit until my knuckles were raw, screaming until I was hoarse, crying in front of everyone. I told them it was time to demonstrate true faith, that anyone who doubted was spiritually weak. There were only about 15 people in the church. The following Sunday, less than half that number. The following Wednesday, no one came to the service. I returned to the hospital angrier than ever. I spent the entire night pacing the halls like a madman, talking to myself, arguing with God, demanding answers. In a moment of utter despair, I locked myself in the hospital bathroom and began beating the walls with my fists until they bled. I looked in the mirror and saw a man I no longer recognized, a stranger with red eyes and a gaunt face. That morning I had a very strange dream that deeply disturbed me. I was standing on Tepeyac Hill completely alone, with no buildings around, just stones and cactus plants. In the distance, an indigenous woman wearing a bright green cloak was walking slowly toward me with a very tender smile. She didn't say a word, just extended her arms as if inviting me to come closer. I woke up startled, drenched in sweat, and I hit the hospital mattress in rage. I shouted, "Get out, Satan!" because I knew exactly what that bright green meant. It was the Virgin of Guadalupe intruding into my dreams to confuse me. I was never going to fall into that trap, never. The next day I found my wife crying, holding something hidden in her hands. When I removed the handkerchief to see what it was, I discovered a rosary, an old wooden rosary that smelled of copal. I asked her where she had gotten it, and she told me her comadre had brought it from Guadalajara, that it was just to pray for our son. At that point, I completely lost my temper, snatched the rosary from her, and threw it in the hospital trash. Then I took it out of the trash and burned it in the parking lot with my lighter. I yelled at her that it was pure witchcraft, that she was going to hinder God's miracles. She just hung her head and wept silently. She didn't even answer me, she just cried. The following week came the most definitive studies, the full medical board. My wife and I entered a cold room full of doctors in white coats. The head neurologist spoke to us very calmly, but each word felt like a hammer blow. He explained that our son's brain was severely damaged, that they had exhausted all available medical protocols, that there was no favorable neurological response, that the organs were functioning only because machines were artificially maintaining them, that perhaps it was time to prepare our hearts for the inevitable. "What do you mean, the inevitable?" I asked, uncomprehending. The doctor looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Medically speaking, there's nothing more we can do. He's in God's hands now." I left that room completely dizzy. I felt like the floor was moving beneath my feet. For the first time in my entire life as a preacher, I didn't know what to pray. I couldn't find the words. I sat on a hospital bench and remained there with my head in my hands, mute, empty, broken inside. That night I had the same dream, the indigenous woman in the green cloak, but now she was sitting next to my son's bed, stroking his hair very tenderly. I wanted to yell at her to go away, but my voice wouldn't come out. I woke up with a racing heart and in a cold sweat. I thought about telling my wife about the dream, but I stayed silent. It was as if something inside me was cracking, but I still clung tightly to my pride. I still believed I could control everything with faith, with prayer, with spiritual warfare, even though I no longer had any strength, no faith, no words, only tiredness, and a fear that gnawed at my insides. The next night, in the hospital room, I opened my Bible to try to read something that would comfort me. The verse from Job came to mind. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." At that moment, I exploded with rage. I threw the Bible against the wall, kicked it, accidentally tore out several pages, sat in a corner, and cried like a little boy. I, who had preached to crowds in stadiums, who had shouted against the idolatry of Guadalupe, who had said that the dark virgin was nothing but painted clay, was now lying there on the filthy floor of a hospital, moaning like a wounded animal. Very early the next day, the doctor called us again. In a very serious voice, he told us it was time to consider disconnecting the machines, that our son's condition was irreversible, that it was a matter of days or maybe hours. My wife squeezed my hand, but I couldn't reciprocate. I just closed my eyes and wanted to disappear from the world. When the doctor finished speaking and told us it was a matter of hours, something completely broke inside my chest. It wasn't just sadness. It was a boiling rage that burned in my stomach and rose to my head. I didn't want to accept anything. I didn't want to listen to anyone else. I didn't even want to look up at the sky. I felt like God had betrayed me, that after serving him so much, he had turned his back on me. And if he turned his back on me, I would turn my back on him too. The next morning, without saying anything to my wife, I left the hospital, got in my truck, and drove straight to the sanctuary of Los Remedios in Cholula, that place where Catholic women always go to pray the rosary in the evenings. I knew I'd find people there, and I went looking for trouble, wanting to vent all my anger on someone. When I arrived, there were several older women kneeling, praying quietly in front of the altar. There were also fresh flowers, lit candles, and the smell of burning incense. The image of the Virgin of Guadalupe was up there with her starry cloak and red roses at her feet. That scene filled me with such great disgust and such profound anger that I climbed the steps without a second thought. I gripped the image tightly and threw it onto the marble floor. I watched it shatter into pieces. Her head rolled to the side, a piece of her cloak dangling. The women screamed in horror. One began to cry uncontrollably, another clutched her chest as if she'd been stabbed. But one remained still, looking at me with tears in her eyes. She spoke to me with profound sadness, without anger. She didn't curse me or yell at me. She simply said, with a calmness that made me even more angry, "One day you'll know who this little mother you're hurting is, my son." I left the sanctuary breathing heavily, almost tripping on the steps. But when I closed the door behind me, I felt an icy chill run from the back of my neck to my heels. And that's when things started to get really weird. That same night at the hospital, while I was trying to get some sleep on the hard chair next to my son's bed, I smelled a very strong, very sweet rose scent, like freshly picked roses in the early morning. But there were no flowers anywhere, not in the room, not in the entire hallway. I got up to look for where that smell was coming from, but I couldn't find anything. It stayed with me all day. The next night, I woke up around 3 in the morning to some very strange music. It wasn't the sound of machines or nurses working. It was as if voices were singing very softly. A beautiful melody, but one that unnerved me. A song that was sinking into my ears and sending shivers down my body. I stopped to investigate and looked toward the end of the hallway. I saw a green light moving slowly. It wasn't a lamp's reflection or a cell phone's light. It was a soft light that seemed to have a life of its own, moving as if it knew where it was going. I tried to forget it, but my head kept going over and over it. Every time I tried to say a prayer, my tongue would get stuck. Every time I tried to open the Bible, I was reminded of the broken picture on the sanctuary floor. It made me nauseous and left me feeling directionless. I also began to notice that my wife wasn't with me like she used to. She spent a lot of time outside the hospital with some women from the neighborhood Catholic prayer group. One day, I saw her holding a rosary, a simple rosary of blue beads. When I asked her what she was doing with it, she told me she was praying for our son and that I was no longer in charge. She spoke to me firmly, her eyes moist, but she never lowered her gaze. That hurt me more than any blow. For the first time in our married life, she had disobeyed me, and I couldn't even yell at her. I just turned my back on her and went to sit in a corner of the hospital, staring at the floor. I began to wonder if all this was divine punishment, if it was a test from God, or if I was simply going crazy. But no matter how hard I tried to put it out of my mind, the images returned again and again. The indigenous woman in the green cloak who was dreaming, the scent of roses that appeared out of nowhere, the strange light in the hallway, and above all, the shattered image. I couldn't get this out of my head. The townspeople were already starting to murmur. They said I was going crazy, that the pastor who preached against the Virgin of Guadalupe was now seeing apparitions. A few brothers from my old church came to visit me out of obligation, but they didn't even enter the room. They just asked for the boy and quickly left. I felt like everyone was distancing themselves from me. Even God seemed distant and indifferent. That night, I was left alone in the room because my wife went out to pray with the other women. I sat in the plastic chair next to my son's bed, watching him breathe very slowly through the machines, full of wires and tubes everywhere. And then a thought came to me that completely paralyzed me. What if I had been wrong all this time? What if everything I preached, everything I shouted into the microphone, everything I proclaimed from the pulpit was a pure lie? What if I had spent my entire life chasing and attacking someone who only wanted to show me love? I couldn't pray. I couldn't open my mouth. I just sat there with my head heavy, my chest aching, and my soul completely empty. In that profound silence, I could only whisper a question, but it wasn't even to God. It was to myself. What if everything I believed in was a lie? At the end of that week, The doctors called us in for the final conversation. The entire medical team gathered with very serious faces, without beating around the bush. They confirmed that the final scan had shown the worst of all. Our son was declared brain dead. There was no more neural activity, no more medical hope. Only machines were keeping him alive artificially. It was time to make the most difficult decision of our lives. My wife wept silently, while I stood stiffly staring at a stain on the white wall behind the doctors. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything. I just felt like they were completely emptying me and leaving me like a hollow shell. We signed papers and scheduled a time to disconnect everything the next morning. The doctor told us it was important to say goodbye, that it might be very hard, but that it was necessary for the grieving process. I remained silent, just shook my head, but inside I was sinking into a bottomless black hole. That night I couldn't take it anymore. I waited for my wife to fall asleep on the hospital bed and then walked aimlessly. The streets were empty and dark, with only streetlights illuminating the cracked sidewalks. I got into my truck and drove, not knowing where, guided by a mixture of rage and desperation that made my hands tremble. I ended up stopping near a vacant lot on the outskirts of Cholula, where weeks earlier I had thrown an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe into a trash can. I remembered when I had taken that image from Doña Carmen's house, put it in a black bag, and tossed it into the bushes like it was pure garbage. Remembering that now hurt like remembering a very serious sin. I stopped the truck, got out, and began walking through the dry grass and stones. My heart was pounding, my chest ached, my hands were sweating, my legs were shaking. It was midnight, cold, and completely silent. When I got close to the spot where I'd thrown the statue, my knees simply buckled. There was no speech, no willpower. I simply collapsed. There, kneeling on the hard ground, alone, dirty, and defeated, I wept like I'd never cried in my entire life. I wept with my face hidden in my hands, and in the midst of my tears I spoke to her, not with the certainty of a believer, but with doubt, with shame, with fear. I asked for help. I begged for a miracle. I told her I didn't know if she was real, that I didn't know what was true anymore, but that if she was listening to me, if she really was that little mother so many people said they loved, that she should save my son, take him by the hand, give him back his life, that I gave her everything, my pride, my ministry, my reason, my name, everything I could no longer bear to carry. Suddenly, a breeze came from nowhere, a gentle breeze that stirred the grass and touched my face. Cold, but tender. The air changed. The smell, too. It smelled of roses, just like those nights in the hospital, a calm, clean smell that didn't fit with that dirty, abandoned place. And there, in the midst of that breeze, exhaustion completely overcame me. I fainted. I don't know if it was fainting or sleep. I only know that everything went black. I woke up with my cell phone vibrating in my bag. The sun was already rising and the orange light hit the dry earth. I answered without thinking. It was my wife, her voice cracking with emotion. She told me that our son had woken up, that he had opened his eyes and said his name, that he had asked for his dad. I was speechless, unable to answer anything. My body froze. My heart pounded. I returned to the hospital, driving as if I had a fire burning behind me. I entered through the front door like a madman, took the stairs 2 at a time. When I got to the room, there he was, sitting, weak, pale, but alive. His eyes were open, his face calm. The nurse was smiling, saying she had never seen anything like this in 20 years of work. The doctors were shocked, with no scientific explanation. They said it was impossible, that he hadn't had any brain activity until just a few hours before, that it was a medical miracle. My wife was sitting next to the bed with our son's hand in hers. The boy was looking up at the ceiling, relaxed. He told us that the whole time he was asleep, he felt a presence near him, a woman wearing a green dress with stars, stroking his hair, telling him not to be afraid, that he would wake up soon. I didn't say anything, I just listened. My heart was beating wildly. My legs were weak. I couldn't speak, pray, or think clearly. I just stared at my son, breathing on his own, moving his eyes, smiling weakly. And inside, everything was like a hurricane. That afternoon, I went for a walk alone through the hospital. I walked with my head down until I sat on a bench in front of the inner chapel. From there, I saw something that nailed me to the spot. Inside the glass altar was a restored image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. It was the same image I had broken weeks earlier in the sanctuary of Los Remedios. The faithful had carefully glued it back together and put it back in its place. The cracks were still visible, but it was whole again. I stared for several minutes. I don't know if it was guilt, fear, or gratitude. Maybe all of it. The image I had thrown to the floor was now looking back at me. And the worst part was that I felt like it was seeing me from the inside. After the miracle, I disappeared for several days. I shut myself in my house, barely ate, and barely spoke to my wife. Words had dried up in my mouth. I lived in a heavy silence that clung to my chest and squeezed my heart. The pain of humiliation mingled with the fear of what was happening inside me. My mind raced. I, who had preached with such conviction against Catholicism, who had fought everyone because of the Virgin of Guadalupe, now didn't know where to fit in. I was lost, aimless, filled with shame and confusion. No one from the church even called me anymore. Some avoided me on the street. Others whispered when I passed by. They said I had gone crazy, that I had lost my mind, that it was all a divine punishment I had brought upon myself. I heard this, but I didn't have the strength to respond. In the midst of that silence, I began to do something I never imagined I would do. I started sneaking into Puebla Cathedral. I always arrived very early, when there were still few people, and I sat at the back, very quiet, without attracting attention. I just stood there watching the masses, the songs, the people praying. It was a strange world for me, full of symbols I had rejected my whole life. It wasn't easy. I was afraid of being seen, of being judged. It embarrassed me that someone I had attacked would recognize me. But at the same time, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It was strange, confusing, but good. It was in this way, between silence and silence, that I began to feel I needed to face my past. I could no longer continue running away from everything I had done. I needed to ask for forgiveness, but asking for forgiveness wasn't easy for me. It meant sure humiliation. One day I gathered my courage and went to the statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the cathedral. The statue had been carefully restored, although the cracks were still noticeable. I went there and stood in front of it, not knowing what to do. I knelt, almost without strength, and touched the base of the statue with my lips. I felt an enormous weight of shame and regret. In my head, I repeated that I had been a fool, that I had been blinded by pride, that I had been worse than Judas. I couldn't hold back my tears. It was the first time I had humiliated myself in that way, acknowledging my mistake so completely. My wife, who had already suffered greatly through all of this, welcomed me at that moment. He told me that the Virgin of Guadalupe had loved me, even when I had spat on her image, that she had never stopped caring for us, even when I denied her. That hurt me, but it also gave me strength. I knew I was no longer alone. Time passed slowly, but I regained my courage. On the day of the Guadalupe festivities, the same festivities where I had spat on the image months before, I decided to face the people, to face my past and my pride. In the crowded plaza, in front of the people who had seen me humiliate that image, I climbed onto the platform the priest had invited me to use. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. The shame was so great that I almost gave up, but I knew I had to speak, that I needed to tell the truth, tell my story, my fall, my mistake, and my miracle. I spoke with a trembling but firm voice. I told them that I had been a man of hate, that I had hurt those who loved me, that I had rejected what I didn't understand. I spoke of when I had spat on the image, of when I had broken my own faith, of when I had lost everything. I spoke of the miracle of my son waking up, of the light I had seen, of the woman in the green dress who had appeared in my dreams. I spoke of the fear, the pain, and the humiliation that brought me to my knees. And I asked for forgiveness. I asked for forgiveness from God, from the people, and above all from the one I had called an idol, but whom I now knew to be a mother, a protector, a friend. The people wept with me. There were people who viewed me with suspicion, others who wept as they hugged me, and even those who once hated me now wiped their tears beside me. I left the platform with the weight of the past still on my shoulders, but with renewed hope in my heart. I had begun to walk the path of humility, of true faith, of sincere dedication, and that day, in the middle of that plaza, I knew my life had changed forever. On the day of the Guadalupe festivities, the town was filled with joy, singing, and prayer. The streets were packed, the stalls were selling traditional food, children were running, people were hugging. It was a day everyone waited for all year. But for me, this day was different. It was the day I would face everything I had experienced, everything I had caused, everything I had broken. The priest of the church invited me to climb onto the platform set up in the middle of the plaza, the same place where I had spat on the image. Months earlier, I felt everyone's eyes on me. Some curious, others suspicious, some still courageous, and many still hopeful. When they placed the microphone in my hand, my heart pounded. It felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. Shame came with it, but also a courage I didn't know I had. It was then that I decided to tell the whole truth without hiding anything. I spoke of the hatred I had carried in my chest, of the ignorance that blinded me, of the times I rejected and humiliated those who only wanted my best. I spoke of my harsh preaching, of the times I distanced myself from my own family because of that foolish pride. I spoke of how I spit on the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe and how that seemed like the biggest mistake of my life. I also spoke of the despair I felt when my son suffered the accident, of how much I tried to pray, fast, and fight for his return, but to no avail. I spoke of the deep pain of seeing everything fall apart and the humiliation of losing my faith. And then I spoke of the miracle, of the moment I hadn't expected, of the gentle breeze, of the woman in the green dress who appeared in my dreams, of the son who woke up, of the peace I had never felt. I told how that changed me, how it made my pride fall, and how it led me to a new path. As I spoke, I saw many people crying, their eyes shining, their faces wet, their hugs tight. I even saw people who had once hated me shedding silent tears. The entire plaza seemed to transform into a place of forgiveness and hope. At the end of my testimony, I handed my Bible to the priest. I told him that the book I had carried and used as a sword was no longer the center of my life, that I no longer wanted to preach with harsh words, but to serve in silence, with humility and love, and that I was now devoted to the Virgin of Guadalupe, whom I had once rejected and hurt, but who saved me. The crowd applauded loudly, and I left the platform feeling the weight of the past, but with a light heart, lighter than it had been in a long time. After the festival, while the town was still celebrating, I joined the pilgrimage that headed toward the Basilica of Guadalupe, like so many other faithful. I went barefoot, feeling the warm earth beneath my feet, walking slowly with my wife and son at my side. I carried on my back a replica of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the same one I had once spat on and smashed. Now, that image was my symbol of life, forgiveness, and love. And on that walk, I felt in my chest a gratitude that words cannot describe. I knew that my story was not only mine, but that of the entire town, of the people who believed, of the God who never gave up on me. And as I walked, I felt that I had finally found my true path. And here my testimony ends, brothers and sisters. I want to wholeheartedly invite you to subscribe to our channel if this story touched you in any way. In the comments, tell me what impacted you most about this story, what you felt when you heard about the miracle, or if you have ever experienced something similar in your own lives. This space is for all of us, to share our experiences of faith, our personal miracles, those times when God or the Virgin Mary manifested themselves in difficult times. It doesn't matter if you are Catholic, Protestant, or of any denomination. We all have stories of overcoming difficulties that can inspire others. Write in the comments what you learned from this story, what stuck in your heart, or simply share your own experiences of faith and miracles. Sometimes, a word of encouragement in the comments can be exactly what someone else needs to hear in their most difficult moment. I read them all and keep them in my prayers. May God bless you enormously, and may the Virgin of Guadalupe cover you with her mantle of love and protection.